Hello, you're watching The Interview on France 24. I'm Catherine Nicholson, and today I'm speaking to the President of Georgia, Salomé Zourabichvili. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Now, we're speaking at a time when you're still actively pushing for closer relations with the EU. There has continued to be creeping occupation in the areas of Abkhazia and South Ossetia by Russian-backed separatists. And we've had a summer where there were protests in the capital Tbilisi that grabbed headlines all around the world. So lots to talk about. I'd like to start with EU relations, however. A couple of days ago, you were in Paris and you quipped that Georgia was ready to take the place of those who want to leave the EU. We all understood that you meant the UK. Now, you have acknowledged in the past that accession is quite ambitious, but you also said recently that you want to implement as much European legislation as possible for the time being. When you're not actually a member state, why make that choice?
Well, because we are a creeping European country. Yes, we are very ambitious, and our perspective, our ambition is very clear, has been repeated, is shared by the whole population, so there is no doubt about that. At the same time, we're looking at what's happening into the European Union. One has to be politically realist and see what is feasible today, what is not immediately feasible. And what we need more than anything else is not to stop the movement that we've had with the European Union, with rapprochement, that has been really a continuous, very successful policy that has brought to the Georgians a sense that Europe was coming closer and we were getting closer to the European Union. And today the challenge is to keep that going. So we have to do it in all the ways possible. And it's not only legislation, it means entering into all the European programs where we can be part of Europe, part of those sectors of Europe where we are ready, that is Europe of education, Europe of culture, Europe of transport, Europe of communication. There are many different segments, and maybe one day you will discover that some have entered the European Union, others have left.
In terms of that rapprochement you're talking about, the EU obviously has been a partner for Georgia for many years, cementing that recently with the partnership agreement. But there is hesitancy. For example, France, for example, seen by one of the countries that's least open to any kind of enlargement. In terms of the EU having more rapprochement with third countries, it does have quite demanding demands about reforms. It's been talking to the EU, to Georgia about, for example, the judiciary fighting corruption for many years. And there are still worries about those areas, aren't there?
To be precise, the issue that we are having and where we're moving is not judiciary fighting corruption. It's the last stage of the reform of the judiciary itself to reinforce the independence of the judiciary, and on which we are exactly now working on that legislation. And to say the truth, what I was saying about the realism is exactly that, to take into account the fact that the political decision-making of the EU is not ripe today because of different countries, to take any decision about enlargement, not only ours, but also that of the countries that are today candidates. And with some of those, we are exactly at the same level. So that is the political question of decision about enlargement, no enlargement, status, not status. What we want to do is a status neutral situation in which, while we are waiting for that and while our partners are not ready, we move within the European Union in all the sectors and places where we can move. And I think that is very well accepted by our partners. I've been discussing with a number of them. And it has also raised the interest of the European Commission when we had this big forum in Georgia in July on the issue of what next for partnership, because we, again, the main thing is we cannot stop.
Yeah.
We can do different things, do them differently, but not stop.
Well, in terms of, as you said, there's many areas where on trade, for example, things have been moving closer together. One of the areas in terms of reforms that's a big issue for the EU as well is, for example, corruption. The government that you represent came in saying it was going to fight corruption. Transparency International has issued a report last year where it talked about Georgia being a place of elite corruption, people in high-ranking public jobs in the judiciary, legislature, etc., who have got very close links to President Zourabichvili, the billionaire backer of the Georgian Dream Party.
That's not what Transparency was talking exactly about, and our rating in Transparency is quite good compared to many countries.
Well, so those kind of postings aren't illegal, of course, but isn't it perhaps a bit damaging to Georgia's image as a reputation to do business, as to be a partner, to have that kind of suspicion about those kinds of high-ranking officials?
I think that we have very little elite corruption, and there are some countries that are within Europe that have some serious problems. We are progressing on those issues despite the past that we've had. We are number 6 in doing business all over the world. So that's we have progressed in the Fitch rating just over the summer, and the prospects are very steady for the next 5 years of these international ratings. So I think that if we take the ratings, the appreciations from World Bank, IMF, and all the institutions, we're not in any difficult problems. What we need to do is to continue on this trend and to show the main challenge, I would say, is to show the Georgian population that despite the problems that exist today in Europe and that everybody sees, that is not going to affect what is our only perspective. In the region where we are, there is really no alternative, not only because culturally, we consider ourselves as Europeans because we share the same values as you have seen when you came, and the wine and everything, but also because the environment is such that it's our only perspective to get as close as we can, as fast as we can, and I think nothing is going to change that.
In terms of the progress that you were talking about and improving the functioning of democracy, perhaps. As you said, Georgia is well viewed, but there are some questions. I mentioned President Zourabichvili, who is a very, very wealthy man, his personal wealth estimated to be about 1/3 of the GDP of the entire country. He was Prime Minister, now head of the Georgian Dream Party.
He's head of the governing party.
And you ran as an independent president, but he very much supported your candidature. That's no secret, of course. Just in terms of the billions at his disposal, is it an unequal playing field, and would you support, for example, more restrictions on election spending within Georgia?
I think
because there is a lot of pessimism.
Yes, we're moving. In fact, we have been looking at, I'm not directly, but the president of the parliament has a group that is including all the parties, and they have been working over the summer on a new electoral reform that exactly looks at the financing of the elections. We're going to have elections in 2020 at the end of the year. And in fact, all the recommendations that have been made by OSCE, ODIHR, based on the last round of elections, are going to be incorporated in the legislation. So there is really definitely this direction in which Georgia is going, which is not going to go back. As to wealthy people in politics, I think we are not the only ones over the world. That is...
Do you see it as a problem, however, that somebody who has such a great amount of Georgia's GDP as his personal wealth, being such a powerful
It's not a part
player,
of Georgian GDP because it's not in Georgia.
As relative to Georgian GDP, however?
Relative to Georgian GDP, it might be a problem, but I think that we have other examples. That's not a choice. But the important thing, I think, is that this wealth is not in Georgia, is not affecting the choices of the Georgian economy and not affecting directly the Georgian economy. That is very important, and that I think should be certainly something that should be looked at, but that's not the case today. So.
Well, in terms of the public mood in Tbilisi, it was quite a tumultuous summer in some ways. I mentioned at the beginning those large-scale protests. Now, they began as a sort of a diplomatic issue. There was a Russian lawmaker who spoke from the Georgian parliament speaker's seat. So there was anger because, of course, of the historic relations with Russia. But there were also, after that, several days of calls for reforms. Now, Mr. Zourabichvili did announce some reforms, like proportional voting in next year's elections. But there are a lot of protesters still saying that that's not enough. They want, for example, the Interior Minister to be fired for giving the order to allow rubber bullets to be fired on protesters. Do you agree with them?
No, we are in France. We know what has been fired in France. I think that when in a country like that, that has 20% of its territory that is occupied, you cannot accept that protests that were, everybody shared those protests, by the way, because I shared them. You cannot have this type of situation when you have in the parliament speeches that do not correspond to the feeling, frustrations of the population.
But in terms of the response,
but then
to protesters,
then it moved. The protest was everyone, and that the response to protesters was that the parliament member had to leave the country, and those are the. But then it moved. It was manipulated and used and abused probably by some radical opposition parties, and there was an attempt to enter violently the parliament, to overthrow the forces that were protecting the parliament. And then I think that in any country, France or any other one, the reaction of the security forces would be the same. So it's very unfortunate. It shouldn't happen. I hope it won't happen again.
But you believe the matter is closed?
I believe the matter is closed, and I think that it should be closed for everyone. Everyone should know that Georgia is a state, and a state that will make the laws respected for everyone, whoever that is. And I'm there for that as a president of the country. I think that I'm protecting the rights of the people, the rights to protest, but to protest in the normal frame of a democratic country.
Well, President Salomé Zourabichvili, unfortunately, we have run out of time. Thank you very much for being our guest today.
Thank you.
On the France 24 interview.
Thank you, and awaiting you in Georgia again.
Indeed. Thank you very much for coming into our studios, and thank you as well for watching. We'll see you soon here on France 24.
Fake news. Noun. False stories that appear to be news, spread on the internet or using other media. At France 24, our job is to provide you with information that's been verified. We check sources, we check facts, we sort what is true from what is fake.
At the France 24 Observers, we verify photos and videos circulating online. If they're fake, we let you know and tell you how we spotted them.
In Fact or Fake, we dig into viral stories around Europe to shake out the truth from the trash.
Every day on Info Migrants' website, we fight fake news spread on social networks about the reality of migration.
France 24, news based on facts.
Liberté, égalité, actualité.